Well, as I see it, most economists are really unclear and don't understand how money is created, and that's a deep, deep flaw in the economics, in economic theory, but also in the economics profession, because on the back of this very flawed idea of where money comes from is created a whole economic infrastructure or superstructure, if you like. So these economists are wrong, and unfortunately it's some of the most prominent economists, and the reason I'm feeling confident about that is because of this Bank of England quarterly bulletin, in which they write about money creation in the modern economy and say very clearly, whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money. And this is what we have been arguing, me and my colleagues at the New Economics Foundation, for some years now, and indeed many other economists have argued this, but have been dismissed, if you like, as heterodox or getting it wrong. We were right all along, according to the Bank of England. It's an enormous breakthrough. The fact is the Bank of England has known this for more than 300 years, since 1694, when the Bank of England was founded. And many economists have known and understood, you know, including Joseph Schumpeter and John Maynard Keynes and J.K. Galbraith, all understood how money is created by the private banking system. The private bankers, if you like, are effectively printing money, whereas we are often misled into believing that only the central bank prints money. In reality, 95% of the money created here in Britain is created by the private banks. Now, that money isn't actually printed because we don't use currency, if you like, pounds and notes in our everyday affairs. 95 or 93% of the money that we use is actually bank money that's transferred digitally between our bank accounts or between us and eBay or wherever we may be making purchases, or with our credit cards. But about 6% of the money we use is in the form of notes and coins. And the private banks can't create notes and coins. Only the central bank can do that, the currency. They are responsible for the currency. But currency makes up a very small part of the money that we spend on a day-to-day basis.
Now, the IMF wrote in 2012 that, quote, bank reserves do not play any meaningful role in the determination of wider money aggregates. The reason is that the deposit multiplier of undergraduate economic textbooks, where monetary aggregates are created at the initiative of the central bank through an initial injection of high-powered money into the banking system that gets multiplied through bank lending, turns the actual operation of the money transmission mechanism on its head. The deposit multiplier is simply a myth. And because of this, private banks are almost fully in control of the money creation process. Why is it that the textbooks, which students use to learn the basic and fundamentals of economics, use this mythology then?
I don't know. That's a very good question. One has to ask this of the economics profession. Some people see it as a very handy way to obscure what the banks are doing. And that might be part of the excuse, that the banks have been very quiet about what they do and haven't had a relationship with economists. But it might also be that economists have chosen to turn a blind eye. But this nonsense about banks lending out reserves is disproved here in the Bank of England's report. It says, first of all, they make a decision whether to give a loan. The money in the bank does not exist until you, the borrower, applies for the loan. The bank then decides whether or not to give you the loan, depending on your credit record and so on. Then this leads to the creation of deposits of money in your bank account. And only then, once the deposits are made, does the bank turn to the central bank for so-called reserves. And that simply is money that enables the Bank of England, private banks, to deal with amongst themselves, to clear their balance sheets amongst themselves. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with real lending, because as is it explained by the Bank of England, it's a misconception that banks can lend out their reserves. Reserves can only be lent between banks, says the Bank of England, since consumers do not have access to reserve accounts at the Bank of England. That's common sense. And yet that is not what's taught in the economic textbook.
But now I want to move on to government, specifically government money as opposed to private money. Now, when we last spoke, you didn't say this directly, but I kind of got the sense that you believe that the current monetary system is destabilizing.
If you look at the period 1945 until 1971, when President Nixon unilaterally dismantled the Bretton Woods system without consulting his partners, by the way, there was no single financial crisis of any significance in the world. It's a period of extraordinary financial stability and indeed a period of high rates of growth. Yes, the point was that the move away from the Bretton Woods system was a move away from managing the banks and the way in which they created credit. And what happened was that the central banks were left with one instrument, the rate of interest, with which to control the amount of credit that is created. But the fact is that although private banks can borrow from the central bank, from the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, at that very low rate, the base rate, they don't lend on at that rate. The spectrum of interest rates at which banks lend is well beyond the control of the central bank. But this base rate, the single rate, is the only instrument that the central bank has to control the creation of credit. Back in the Bretton Woods days, banks were prevented from making any old loan, and they were particularly prevented from lending for speculative purposes, for speculation. There were restrictions on what they could lend for. Those restrictions were lifted, and the general view was the market was best positioned to decide whether or not a loan would be repayable. And so a lot of lending then went out of productive economic activity, if you like, which creates jobs and generates income and helps with the repayment of the loan, into speculative economic activity. Now, you know, if you bet on the lottery, you could win $100 million. Or you could lose completely. And that's what's wrong with speculative activity, is that it doesn't always guarantee a rate of return with which to repay the original loan. But banks were increasingly encouraged, or they were freed up, if you like, by the deregulation process to engage in speculative lending. And this then went into assets and inflated the value of assets.